that point has to be made because of this. I don't think it's excessive to say that in the West, we have been crafted to look at the Palestinians as, by and large, a source population for terrorism. Palestinian and terrorist was a very common doublet of terms in the late 20th century. And this is inappropriate. To be sure, if you have the conflicts arising between a resident Palestinian majority as it's being invested in by immigration coming from primarily, but not uniquely, Europe, and an immigration of the Jewish population, that you are going to get acts of violence, many of them entirely regrettable. Some of them called terrorism. Terrorism is a strange thing and it's not so easy to define. Nevertheless, there are plenty of acts of terrorism committed by Palestinians against Jews and others. But it has to be noted that in this process of conflict, terrorism was practiced on both sides as they grew antagonistic to each other. As is indicated here by the two images. You have Palestinian terrorism over here, and Jewish terrorism you've heard much less about, for reasons I'll talk about soon enough. The point being is, you're going to see, however you wish to define terrorism, it was something practiced by both sides. In the run-up to the end of World War II and in the immediate post-war period, and the reason why I need to point that out is because if you look at sort of that image to the right here, when this pot was boiling that was set up by the British with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where you have an incoming population and a resentful domestic population who has no choice in what is happening to it as it's being displaced, the British realized they had a boiling pot here that would explode, and the British proposed curbing Jewish immigration and in establishing a Palestinian state, along with the Jewish state. All right, the British thought, hey, look, we need to provide states for both these. We'll start to do some subdividing in here. Well, what happened was terrorist acts were committed all the way around, specifically by Jews on the British. This is a classic example. The premier example of that here is where the famous bombing at the King David Hotel in 1946, where the British headquarters was located. It was a terror bombing against the British leadership, because the British leadership was actually talking about perhaps subdividing these lands and making sure that the Palestinians had a cut. This was seen as offensive to profound Jewish nationalists, which weren't all Jews by any means, all right? Just as the thought of losing territory was offensive to Palestinian nationalists, which weren't all Palestinians. And it is ironic. And by the way, you can see by the stats over here, 91 people died in the King David Hotel bombing in 1946. 28 were British, 41 were Arab, 17 were Jewish. And the leaders of the terrorist bombings, or bombers, was David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. Both would go on to become prime ministers in Israel. So if we're going to assail Palestinians as being a source population for terrorism in the region, fine, but then you're going to have to do the same thing for the Jewish nationalists as well. The very fact that they raised those terrorists to becoming to being elected as prime ministers shows you the ultimate acceptability of these actions. Generally, people who condemn these type of things, and they rightfully should be condemned, but they're willing to accept the same behavior if it's done by a group they identify with. Human hypocrisy is timeless. Terrorism is truly in the eye of the beholder. Okay, this was essentially the situation in the Holy Land until World War II and the immediate aftermath of World War II. That Great Britain was sitting on a powder keg of its own making, especially with the Balfour Declaration. All right, amongst Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, and Jews, a lot of them immigrants who had come in. All right. In 1946, as indicated by this map here, the British took part of the land they controlled that was called Transjordan. All right. The British took this land over here that's called Transjordan. It was called Transjordan because you can see the Jordan River running right over here. Transjordan was the land on the other side of the Jordan River. The British took part of the land they controlled and established the independent state of Transjordan, which you can see here in 1946. Now, nobody says Transjordan anymore. They just say Jordan. So we have the country of Jordan coming to existence. Observation you wanted to make note of here is note again, just like you saw in sub-Saharan Africa, it is the European powers, the British specifically here, who are establishing these boundaries, creating new political units where there weren't ones before. And doing so without the direct consultation of local populations. That's going to cause a problem in the future, just like it has in sub-Saharan Africa, of which we already talked about. Now, when Transjordan came into existence, it was all the land on the other side of the Jordan River, except for one piece. There's a piece of Transjordan here. Let me see if I have a map that shows that. That's on the western side of the Jordan River. There it is, right there. This was part of Transjordan. It's called the West Bank. And the West Bank is called the West Bank because it was the piece of Transjordan which was on the west bank of the Jordan River. And so, when Jordan came into existence, what occurs is, and this was 1946, it was also that very year that the British decide to pull out of the British Mandate their control of this area. They decided to pull out in 1946. They had essentially were sponsoring a lot of the divisions between Arabs and Jews, as is indicated by this picture here, which is obviously something like this is unsustainable. Decided to pull out in 1946 and then completed the pullout in 1948, 2 years later. You can understand why the British might want to do this. It was a powder keg of their own making. They don't want to be sitting on top of this problem. Remember, World War II just ended in 1945, 3 years earlier, and the British were more concerned about rebuilding at home. Got problems at home after World War II. Don't want to be investing resources in dealing with the problems here separating Palestinians and Arabs, despite being the authors of much of the political architecture for the problem. Now, 2 years later, well, put it this way. The British pull out here in 1948. And when the British pull out in 1948, you can understand what's going to happen to what the Israeli, the Jewish population is going to say. The Jewish population is going to say this. All right, the British have pulled out. They were our sponsors. They secured our existence in this location. We are surrounded by Muslim Arab populations. What is going to happen if the British pull out and we do not have a benefactor like the British to secure us? You can understand what they're going to do. And so the reaction is all too predictable. All right. The reaction was this. The Jews in Palestine declared themselves, well, they declared the country, the region, the state, the unit of Palestine gone. They declared to replace it was the state of Israel. As you can see here, the state of Israel is born 1948. So we have a new country coming into existence. Unfortunately for the Palestinians, it was comprised of their landscape. Thus, we have this situation here. Israel comes into existence in 1948 out of Palestine. You have Transjordan, well, let's just say Jordan, came into existence, created by the British in 1946, with a piece of Jordan, which is the West Bank, which is on this side of the Jordan River. And by the way, once Israel had declared itself into existence, nobody would recognize this strange creation initially. It was only until 2 days later, after it was declared in May, that when the United States recognized Israel as an independent unit, followed by the Soviet Union, another example of the outside powers coming into the fragmented Middle East, just like they did with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In this particular instance, once the U.S. recognized it, the rest of the world followed suit, because after World War II, the United States was hegemonic. In other words, it just was utterly dominant in international politics and in the international economy. And therefore, we have the creation, again, in the approximate center of the Muslim Arab world, which you can see here, in the approximate center of the Muslim Arab world, indicated by, well, much of this green is Muslim and Arab, certainly Muslim. Muslim is all the green here. It's not all Arabic speaking in here, of course not. But what you have is in the center of the Muslim world, you have a state that is not Muslim dominated, and that's Israel in 1948. And its principal benefactor is the United States. This gave rise to expressions of terrorism on both sides. In fact, there would be tons of Palestinians who would be displaced with the declaration of Israel as a state out of Palestine. And so you got tons of Palestinian refugees fleeing the country, not because they plan on leaving forever, but there was too much immediate violence. They want to survive it, so they want to step away from the immediate conflict zone, as refugees tend to do, with the intention of returning. Keep that point in mind. And of course, if you're getting more Palestinian refugees streaming out of Palestine with the creation of Israel, where's the logical place that they're going to go to? Well, you can see that here. All right, displaced Palestinian refugees, and where do they go? The most logical place is into the West Bank, which was part of Transjordan, or shall we just say Jordan? A lot went into the Gaza Strip, which was part of Egypt, by the way. And thus you understand the circumstances which brought in the state of Israel. A state that's only been around, well, you do the math there, I don't know, 72, 70, whatever, shall we say, more than 7 decades now. So you have a new Israel, Jewish homeland, if you would. And by the way, Israel declares itself to be the homeland for all Jews. All Jews have a right to return. Keep that in mind because it'll resonate in a bit. Okay, so we have Israel coming into existence in 1948. And of course, the surrounding Muslim Arab states are certainly unhappy about that. From their point of view, this looks like something from the Crusades, where the Western powers sponsored these military interventions in the Middle East to control the Holy Land, and in the process created a number of what was referred to as Crusader states. 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. This is very offensive to the surrounding Muslim Arab populations. And so in Israel felt itself, of course, beleaguered by these Muslim Arab populations, and the result was an attack upon Israel by the surrounding Arab states, as indicated sort of roughly here by this map. To make a long story short, the Arab states were defeated and have been defeated by a much better trained, prepared, and financed Israeli military. There have been actually 4 major military conflicts between Israel and its neighbors since Israel's formation. A number of other hostilities, but 4 major conflicts between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I'm not going to ask you and quiz you on them all, but there was the 1948-49 conflict, sort of indicated right over here. The 56 conflict with Nasser, let's not worry about the fineries there. The 67 conflict. The 73 to 74 conflict. Oh, hold it, there's another one. I have to add in the 1982 conflict as well. I'm not going to ask you about all these, but you can see that Israel comes into existence and is fighting for its existence. You can consider that noble or not ignoble, given the conditions that were present when Israel was formed with respect to Palestinians. That's up to you and your politics. Now, I'm not going to ask you about all these different conflicts. And one of the reasons why the Arab populations have been so unsuccessful is quite frankly, they're not industrialized. They're not as economically as developed. They don't have the same high-skilled labor force. And they don't coordinate with each other very well. Most of these states were ruled by some dictator of some sort, often a monarch. And the result is you do not get the integration with each other necessary to effectively deal with Israel. I'm not suggesting they should or shouldn't. I'm just saying Israel's domination over them is nuanced in any case. Now, I talked about various conflicts that Israel's had with its Muslim Arab neighbors. I'm not going to ask you about them all, except for one. There's one you definitely need to know. It'll definitely be a test question. And that's the Arab-Israeli War. That's the 1967 conflict. That's the most important one. And the reason why, it was a fascinating war. Because in one preemptive airstrike, Israel destroyed about 25 Arab airfields, destroyed about all the Egyptian, Syrian, Jordanian, and Iraqi planes. This was followed by mass armor movements into the Sinai Peninsula, as suggested by this photo. Notice using what is an American tank. The key point is that Israel seized critical territories that you need to know. And you can see them here. As a function of the 67 war, territories occupied by Israel in the Arab-Israeli War, there are 3 key territories that you need to know. They're listed here in blue. All these territories were taken from the surrounding Arab Muslim states. First off, the Golan Heights, as you can see here, that was taken from Syria. Israel took that. The West Bank was taken from Jordan. All right, so Israel took that. And of course, the Gaza Strip here was taken from Egypt. These are often referred to as the occupied territories. When somebody says the occupied territories in the Middle East, they're talking about these three territories taken from the surrounding Muslim states by Israel in the '67 war. And it's been in these occupied territories that so much conflict and friction has been prominent for the last 40, going on 50 years now. We're not going to go into the fineries of that, but the critical territory that you need the circumstance we need to look at is the West Bank. Obviously, the West Bank, as you can see here, is the biggest, most important territory taken from an Arab Muslim state, taken from Jordan in this particular instance. It's still occupied today, although some people don't want to use that type of language. It's the biggest point of contention, not the only point, the biggest point of contention where Palestinian resistance still exists and is the strongest.